Howdy everybody. Today I have a piece of Blackjack oak that a friend of mine, Drew, brought over. He brought me over two pieces. One piece we cut, side grain, and the other piece we cut end grain. I saved the end grain for a little later because this is very green and it was very punky, so I may or may not treat the other piece, the end grain piece, with the glue and water and paper towel method because of the punkiness that was in this piece. But anyways, it's Blackjack oak. This is the first time me ever turning it. It's very beautiful wood. It stinks, I can say that, and it's hard. It's very hard for being a green wood. I'm still getting decent shavings off of it, but I did have to push a little harder with this wood because it is a lot harder. Anyways, I attempted to cut a circle out on my bandsaw, but unfortunately I had changed my blade to a smaller blade so that way I can get a sharper radius when I'm cutting circles, and I made my circle jig according to my larger blade. So I just have to go and modify it again, and I was fooling around with it. It was just taking forever, and I couldn't get it quite right, so I just eyeballed it and ended up making an egg shape instead of a round shape, so that's why it's out of balance and a little wobbly. I ended up taking it off way more than what I intended to. The spalting was mostly around the edges, and I was hoping to save a lot of that, and unfortunately I had to cut more off than I like to, but it happens, so you just do with what you got and move forwards. So I'm just roughing it out right here and trying to feel for the punky areas and seeing if I can't cut past it without having to make it too small, because it already is kind of smaller than what I intended. And I'm sorry about this camera angle. My camera must have shifted after I had positioned it, and you can barely see my tool in the wood, but you can at least see it taking shape. So I appreciate your patience with that. It's just this, I guess mostly just this beginning part, and then you'll be able to see better, I promise. Being I had a lot of punky spots in the bowl, and I didn't want to have to cut them all away and then make a really dinky bowl, because I had no idea how deep the punky really was. And you can't use epoxy on wetter woods because epoxy doesn't adhere to it. A friend of mine, Rob Heath, he wrote me about a idea of using baking soda and then putting the coloring powder in it with CA glue, and that seems to work really well, and it does adhere pretty good to the wood, even though it is, still green or still wet. So that's what you seen me doing just a few minutes ago. I just put my color powders in with a little bit of baking soda, put some CA glue in the crack or the punky areas, and then just rub in the baking soda and the color powder. It really works really well. Stiffens up the fibers, and you don't have to use as much CA glue trying to fill those cracks or holes or voids. So keep that in mind for wet woods when you're turning and you have cracks or voids or something you need to fill. The baking soda works really well. I'm spraying the inside of this with water because I'm about to do the rim, and when it starts to lose water, it starts to dry and starts to warp. And being that this was a really hard wood, I knew that would probably happen pretty quickly, because normally it does with oak, at least with my experience. So that's why you see me spraying it with water. I wanted to get that rim shaped and under control without it starting to warp on me once I started taking the meat out of the middle. I had a little knot that I chipped out when I was cutting it. It just flung out, and fortunately I was like, well, I'll try to dry that as much as I can once I get it shaped, and then use my 5-minute epoxy. Like I said, it doesn't adhere very well to to wet woods, so I just took my heat gun and fill it. And unfortunately, I thought I was recording during that process, but I didn't, so that's why I'm explaining it now instead of waiting for it to show it to you, because it didn't record. I just took my heat gun, like I said, and tried to dry as much as I could around that rim, and then used tape. You see it here, it's taped off to hold the epoxy in place. And it did stay rubbery, like the epoxy did, because the wood was, so moist still, that it took until I was finishing it to actually harden. It was still sticky. You can see my fingers kind of sticking to it a little bit. There's just too much moisture in the wood for it to stick and adhere. But it did shape up just fine, sanded just fine, even with it a little still, I guess rubbery is what I want to use the word. But it hardened, eventually hardened, thank goodness. I guess once the wood the moisture dried out of the wood, the epoxy was finished curing. Here I'm putting my mixture of sanding sealer, or what I use for sanding sealer is 50/50 lacquer and lacquer thinner. Putting it all over the bowl really good before I even sand it, because it was so punky in so many areas. I wanted to try to help stiffen up those fibers before I started to sand. So I let that dry completely. I went and ate some lunch and came back out, and then I started to sand. But I think I just let it put it on until it just wouldn't stop absorbing it, because those punky areas, like I said, were just really bad. And the lacquer and lacquer thinner seems to work pretty good in stiffening up those fibers. I would like to try other sanding sealers, but you guys know as well as I do, they're a little on the pricey side. So the only thing I don't like about the lacquer and lacquer thinner as a sanding sealer, and I'm sure I could cut it back a little bit more and it won't do this, is the buildup that it creates sometimes on resin pieces or you know, pieces that are a lot smoother when you sand them. So if you use the same method I do for a sanding sealer, I would just say cut it a little bit more. And there's also really great recipes out there by using shellac. And this weekend I did make a batch of just shellac and denatured alcohol, and I'm going to try using it on some pieces instead and seeing how well that works versus the lacquer and lacquer thinner. It's all just experiment, trying to find an inexpensive way to achieve a good end result, and that's what it's all about, right? I sanded this piece down to 400 grit, and then I applied my lacquer and lacquer thinner. For some reason I didn't record that, and I'm just cutting that back with a green scrub brush you use for dishes. You can get them at Walmart or Dollar Tree, I think is where I get them. I used the Axe abrasive paste on it first, and that didn't record. Now I'm applying the restoring polish, which just absolutely made that grain, pop and stand out. I really loved the grain in this piece. It looked like a rose, kind of where the pith was at. And then I applied the OB Shine juice, and then that was it as far as finish goes. I do have a pair of cold jaws, so that way I can turn bowls around and take the tin ends off, but this bowl was just too big for those jaws. My dad had come over, had stopped by, and thank goodness he got out of the way when he did. I kind of knew that this would probably crack, and I was going to turn off the lathe, and boom, the tin end, last piece just snapped off. It flung off, and I almost caught it. I'm usually turned pretty slow when I do that. So anyways, it turned out just fine, and I just take a chisel and get the rest of the nub off, sand it down, put my burn my name in on the bottom, and put some OB Shine juice, and there it is. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I pray you have a wonderful weekend. Take care. God bless.